Greetings, everyone. This is Kathleen Yarhart. I'm the Program Director for Special Education Outcomes at the Council of Chief State School Officers. We have been doing a webisode series for the past year on inclusive leadership. And today we're going to take a look at inclusive leadership as it relates to return to school after the crisis. Certainly, most of our states have had schools and districts closed down for a number of months, and using MTSS systems to leverage that return. We're excited to be joined by friends from the Center on PBIS and the MTSS Research Network out of Michigan, and we'll introduce those folks in just a few minutes. I know we were having a little bit of difficulty technically at the beginning, so hopefully everyone will be joining here in the next few minutes, but we are going to go ahead and get started. Oops. There we go. If you could review these tech norms with me, we're asking that everyone log into the Zoom system. If you'd like to engage your camera, we're glad to see your smiling face. And upon entering, if you can put in the chat pod your name, your role, and your organization. And thank you again for joining us today. Again, be in control of yourself, mute and unmute yourself as needed. And we will be asking questions at the end of this webinar via chat pod, or if you'd like to raise your hand, glad to call on you. We'll start out with introduction and framing from Kaylin Connolly on the work that we've been doing around inclusive leadership, and then go right into our introductions of Brandi Simonsen and Steve Goodman, and let them talk a little bit about how they are looking at PBIS systems of leveraging MTSS and what it might look like with state and district systems. And then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for question and answer. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kaylin Connolly, to talk about this initiative and this work.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay, great. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today's webisode. We wanted to start by sharing a little bit of context on the webisode series to frame today's topic. Over the past few years, CCSSO has been providing support to states to ensure that school leaders have the knowledge and skills they need to lead inclusive learning environments and effectively serve students with disabilities, especially now during this time as school leaders prepare to restart schools and ensure continuity and recovery of learning for all students. In 2018, we, in partnership with the National Collaborative on Inclusive Principal Leadership, an alliance of a little over 20 organizations, worked to develop the online resource for states up on the screen, Supporting Inclusive Schools for the Success of Each Child, a guide for states on principal leadership. And this guide now guides a cohort of states in their work to advance inclusive leadership and policies and practices across the principal pipeline, from initial preparation to ongoing professional development and school improvement, and can really be used by all states. Next slide. I'll highlight just one of the strategies included in that online guide to support states around inclusive leadership, which is strategy 5, provide targeted supports to districts and schools. We thought that this strategy in particular aligns well with the presentation today. So up on the screen are just a few example actions or recommendations for state leaders. And especially now during this time of planning for inclusive school restart and recovery, states can provide direct services and resources to districts and schools around effective inclusive principal leadership practices, including implementation of MTSS framework in this new context. States can also identify schools and or districts that model effective inclusive leadership practice and what that looks like, including implementing MTSS successfully, which we know is happening across the country, to scale to other districts and schools. And There are other strategies up on the guide. Encourage you all to check it out. But without further ado, and with that context, want to turn it over to our presenters to share more about a new resource for state, district, and school leaders on leveraging MTSS for school restart and recovery. Brandi, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, and I am going to chat slowly while I do two things at once, which I have stopped being able to do as effectively as I used to do pre-pandemic. All right, so I'm excited to spend this afternoon with those of you watching live and whatever time of day it is for folks who catch this as a video recording. I currently have the privilege of co-directing the Center on PBIS. And my day job is I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut. This is going into my 16th year there. Before that, I had the opportunity to direct a school for all students identified with disabilities. And the way they found themselves to my school was through really significant challenging behavior. So a lot of the lessons I learned there around some pretty intense behavioral crises, I think have actually positioned me and all of my colleagues to think about this kind of different approach in ways that we've dealt with other kinds of crises in the past and some of the lessons we can apply to our current situation, whether those crises were coming back to school after a natural disaster, after a behavioral event in a school like mine, or in some of our cities and our schools, we've experienced things like school shootings. So a lot of our colleagues have had the chance to help schools recover and respond from those types of crisis events. And so all of that has been brought together as we've thought about guidance going forward for whether we're still in or returning after crisis has kind of helped us emerge out of the pandemic. So I'm going to talk just at a slightly higher level about one of the resources we've created. And I feel like I'm the warm-up act for Steve Goodman, who is going to then give some much more concrete examples and kind of thinking around what is the role of states in supporting districts and schools, educators, and students. So the resource I'll talk about is the one that you're seeing on the screen, very small, and I'll pop it up in a bigger screenshot in just a second. But all of this information comes from our Center on PBIS. So our website is pbis.org. The long version of the website gets you specifically to this page, but if you go to our main page, there are scrolling banners, so it'll be really obvious where these resources live. And this particular guide, we had the opportunity to collaborate with 4 other national centers. And so it was a fantastic chance to talk across folks who focus on state level work like the CCSSO Center, the State Implementation and Scaling Up of Evidence-Based Practices Center, to be specific. The National Integrated MTSS Research Network, which is a newer network that's housed at multiple universities across the country, really looking at the specific effects of integrating academic and behavior support. The National Center on Improving Literacy and the Lead for Literacy Centers, which are 2 centers out of the University of Oregon that obviously have an emphasis on literacy, but kind of like us with behavior, we think about the work we are doing being much broader and thinking about supporting multi-tiered systems of support in schools. So as we came together, this group was reflecting on what is our current context. And I'm sure each of you, if you think about the challenges or opportunities that you're facing within your district, state, and within our country, have slightly different stories about why this work is important. For us, some of the main challenges we were concerned about were the stories we continue to hear about students having lost access to instruction, lost access to support, and headlines and concerns about things like the COVID slide, the specific impact on that loss of opportunity for students with disabilities, and what that's going to mean for us as we welcome students back. And although a lot of the emphasis in the news media has been on academic gains, I think most of us are thinking about all of the areas in which students are going to need additional support when they return. And so when I see this slide, it always kind of gives me this pause of anxiety for some of the really significant challenges that we know families and students have experienced, whether it's just a gap in education, whether it's personal or kind of additional loss within families, within communities. But kind of flipping that a little bit, we've also seen people take this as an opportunity to pause and really think about what it is that schools serve kind of what functions they serve for our population. So we've seen schools step up over the spring in amazing ways and cater to families and student needs in ways that honestly none of us could have even thought about before March. And I think through some of those lessons that we've learned ourselves in our districts and our states, and through work of think tanks, we're starting to see this opportunity to really think through what education means, what's working, and for whom it's working. The other opportunity that we have right now is the pandemic has shown a spotlight on the inequities in our society, right? These are not new. They have been around literally for centuries, but we have the country finally waking up and being very loud and vigilant around the importance of focusing on all, and specifically talking about Black Lives Matter. And for us in education, that gives us an opportunity to really think about the role of equity in our work. And when we're thinking about reimagining, rethinking, or even just going back to basics with our practices, really asking the questions about for whom do those practices work, for whom are they implemented with fidelity, and so really kind of interrogating our own work with this equity lens. So for us, when we approached the work, the guiding principles came back to what we often do in PBIS. And as we often do, we started with a focus on equity. So as part of that, we talked about that being the first priority to all of the work. And for us, MTSS is a framework or a vehicle through which we can achieve equitable implementation and outcomes. Not just accidentally, right? We have to be intentional and purposeful in our implementation. And to do that, we need to be thoughtful about disaggregating data and differentiating supports for students. And I'll add, even though it's not on the slide, for families and for educators, because as we go back, everyone is going to have had a different experience and have a different set of needs that they come with. And by using data, we can identify those needs early, we can monitor across time, and we can better plan, implement, and then adjust our implementation of practices to, again, both monitor but actually realize equitable implementation and equitable outcomes. So outcomes become then the filter through which we make decisions. So we think about student growth and benefit being central to every decision we make, whether it's a decision in a specific classroom for how to respond to a student, or whether it's a decision of the state around policy and implications of the choices we're making for all schools within our state. So we think about student outcomes reflecting not just kind of their own abilities, but really the opportunities they've been provided and looking to make sure that those opportunities, again, have been equitable. We've always, as a center, emphasized evidence-based practices, and that's true for all of the centers I referenced. And we've also always emphasized the importance of fidelity, so implementing practices well. At this time, one of the things that we've reflected on is we can't go back thinking we can do everything. Our resources are tight, our staff are stressed. And so while we've always emphasized evidence-based and high fidelity, we're really going to hold ourselves to this idea of doing the smallest number of things we can have that are going to have the biggest impact. So the smallest number of effective, culturally relevant practices to have the biggest impact for all. And that message is one that folks like George Sagai, Rob Horner have echoed across time, but it becomes incredibly relevant right now. The other piece that Steve and folks who have been doing the work around integration have taught us across time is how critical it is to integrate and align practices. It's always important, but especially right now, again, as resources are stretched, as things are stressed, being able to integrate and align practices allows us to not just be more effective, but also more efficient with the resources we have. We've mentioned already, and you all know, data is a huge part of an MTSS framework. And so thinking about using data to guide all of our decisions from who needs what, so screening, progress monitoring, how well it's working, looking at outcomes to see for whom it's working, and disaggregating the data so we know for which subgroups it's working or not, and monitoring our fidelity of implementation. There have been some different messages around screening lately. And so for us, we think about screening as a process, again, to identify needs and match need to intervention, not a specific tool. So I think the kind of big idea of screening is one that hopefully continues to be relevant across all of our states. And the last guiding principle or critical element of our work is the systems, which is especially at the state level, so much of what we do, right? We are building systems to support implementation in districts. Districts are building systems to support implementation in schools. Schools are building systems to support implementation in classrooms and with individual students. So that's kind of messy and a lot. But if you bring it back to the basics, again, it's about equitable implementation, equitable outcomes, thinking about using data to drive decisions, investing in a small number of evidence-based, culturally relevant practices to have a big impact, and then building the systems to support implementation of those practices across the different levels. So when I mentioned levels, we're familiar with this idea of an implementation cascade. And depending on which kind of bubble you fit in, you might have different experiences within that. But for us, we thought about at the state level what we're doing to build and support systems for districts, districts again supporting schools, schools supporting classrooms, and classrooms being the biggest support for individual students. We initially had this conceptualized kind of as that trickle down of support, and our colleagues and friends at CCSSO reminded us of the importance of feedback loops, right? So it's not just that we're providing support down the cascade, but that we are gathering lessons, we're gathering feedback, and together we're learning. And so we have feedback loops built back in. And I'm sure for each state who has already released their guidance, you've experienced the benefit of having feedback from many districts and educators, right? Because we're learning all together, especially in areas like going back into remote instruction, which we may end up doing in some states. We don't have as much evidence in those areas. We have some, but as we're gathering information about what to do next, it's critical those feedback loops are there. The second kind of big message we talked about beyond the implementation cascade was leveraging systems that are built already within schools, states, districts, to make sure that we're not kind of starting over from scratch, but we're leveraging what's already there. And we're thinking about how to enhance what we need to enhance to support our transition back. So for example, we think about, especially at the state and district level, executive team functions, which are depicted at the top of this graphic in blue. We've always talked about the importance of stakeholder engagement. I mentioned the feedback loops on the last slide. But right now we've got to think about, for stakeholder engagement, probably intensifying or enhancing our communication routines. So how often we're reaching out, how often we're pulling information back in. And we might be thinking about what stakeholder groups are at the table and which ones maybe are not. And how do we think about expanding that table to include a broader representation of folks? We might be right now revisiting policies that have had implications either that have resulted in disproportionate outcomes or that aren't matching the current context. So thinking about discipline policies that might be relying on in-school behavior, or attendance policies that might be providing consequences for students and families when very real illnesses are impacting their ability to come into school. So again, for each of those areas, we've thought about enhancements, tweaks, and suggestions tied to action items. Looking at the middle part of that diagram, you see leadership teaming is the most critical and kind of biggest bubble. And so we often think about team-driven and data-driven decision-making, whether we're talking state, district, or school level. And as I mentioned with stakeholder engagement, again, thinking about who's at the team. As we're thinking about the newer context, folks like public health experts, school nursing, information technology or instructional technology experts become even more relevant to have as part of that decision-making body than we may have realized they were before March. They were always relevant, but I think we've all learned about the importance of having those folks really brought into and integrated into leadership voices. And another part of that team is not just the executive functions, but the implementation functions. So thinking about the training, coaching, evaluation, and the support for staff as we return. So a lot of our colleagues have been talking about the importance of staff wellness and how we set staff up for success by teaching them the new routines, getting them comfortable, ensuring they feel and actually are safe. And thinking about how we can tweak our approaches, whether it's remote coaching or remote training, to ensure they have the skills they need, whether they're going back into remote, hybrid, or in-person environments. And at the bottom of this graphic, we think about celebrating successes. So what are those demonstrations at the classroom level, at the school level, at the district level of people stepping up and doing this work really well? And how do we learn from those examples? Again, we mentioned back in spring, having watched people step up in ways that were amazing and supportive. We watched people pivot into food delivery and things that, again, schools have always provided these various functions for students and families, but they stepped up across our country in amazing ways. So how do we learn from and celebrate those successes so we can continue to grow them? So in the guide, and Steve will give you some more specific examples, there are tables that take each of those elements, ask us to think about a few key considerations, but then prioritize action items for things we can do now, so prior to the return to school, during that initial transition back, and then as we get more into the routine of whatever this year is going to look like in your school district or state. So those tables for us become really helpful to push action planning. So each state, district, or school can think about what are the pieces that we need to really enhance or work on, and where do we already have strengths that we might need to emphasize. So the third and final piece of this guide really talks about the practices. And at the state level, we're probably less tied into the very specific practices, but as we move to the districts who are responsible for training and coaching schools, as we move to the schools who are supporting educators and especially educators implementing in their classroom, these are critical considerations. And so as I mentioned already in our guiding principles, we held ourselves accountable to think about a small number of culturally relevant evidence-based practices. Those things that we feel if we do well, we can have the biggest impact for all students. So specifically, we talked about going back to basics, which I mentioned at the very beginning, was one of the lessons that we've learned from the variety of different crisis experiences we've had in the past, is really doubling down on basic, good, tier 1 universal prevention, and then using our data to adjust. And for us, those basics include connecting. So connecting with students, connecting with each other as faculty, connecting with parents. The second big bubble is around screening. Again, screening not as a tool, but as a process to identify levels of risk and levels of need. And by doing that, match intervention. We talked about support. So support being those things that we do to set students in our classrooms up for success. So things like ensuring our learning environment is safe, that we have predictable routines, that we have positive expectations and that we've taught those, that we're reminding kids how to follow those expectations, and especially for schools going back in person, we know there's going to be lots of opportunities for reminders about distance and mask use and whatever, and that we're catching students doing things well and celebrating that. So we always think about at least a 5-to-1 ratio of positives to correctives. So if we are having to correct some different kind of behavioral errors, if you will, that we're providing at least 5 positives for every time we're correcting. Within the teach bubble, we think about high leverage academic practices. So those things that we know are likely to support students in their growth academically. But we also have talked about how to interweave social, emotional, and behavioral skills instruction within those academic practices so that we're not teaching things in silos, but we're bringing them together. And then finally, the 5th practice we talked about was monitoring. So again, using data. And by using data, we can then enhance, adjust, or intensify practice implementation to meet the needs of all students. And while we think about those practices as critical for students, we've also talked about those practices as critical for families and for staff. By doing those, we've talked about being able to then create a positive, predictable, and safe learning environment, with the ultimate goal or outcome being all students' social, emotional, behavioral, and academic growth. And as a special educator, while I just said all, I think about these practices being necessary for all, but especially critical for students at risk or with more intense disabilities. And there will be a supplemental resource coming out attached to this guide that will focus exclusively on those students. So students who are already identified with disabilities, who are going to, we know from the beginning, need more intensified levels of one or more of these practices. So in the guide, there are again tables that give examples of how to think about supporting practice implementation for the district, school, and classroom level. And because we know that a one-size-fits-all never makes sense, but especially doesn't make sense this fall, we tried to give examples of the two endpoints. So with schools going back fully remote, schools going back fully in person, with the idea that those of you going back into hybrid modes would be able to pick and choose the different elements from each column based on what maximizes the success for your students. So what would you do in person versus remote to maximize the success of that learning experience for your students? So all of that, which I said fairly quickly, is in the resource that's posted on pbis.org. And I just wanted to highlight, if you scroll down on that website, there are school versions of the guide in that middle column. There are state-only and district-only versions of the guide that are more focused. And there will be resources also populating that include webinars like the one today that will now show up under the state and district column. And we'll continue to build resources across the year. As we learn more, we'll provide better support across the year. So please continue to check back and visit our website. And with that, I am going to say thank you to you all for letting me talk with you for the last 20 minutes or so. I'm going to stop sharing and tag Steve in to give some very concrete versions and examples of that.
Thank you, Brandi. You should be seeing my screen now. So what I wanted to, again, thank you all for being here, as Brandi mentioned, and thank our hosts from CCSSO for having us. I hope to do a couple things in the next few little bit of time we have with you. I want to reiterate and build upon the structures that Brandi was talking about. I want to provide a few recommendations and then give some examples of recommendations for implementing during this current disruption for both at the state level and at the district level. So with this idea, I really like this quote of pivoting. We've been hearing a lot of different sayings that are going on, and certainly the new normal is one, and pivoting is another. But with this quote, I like the idea that we are not changing our vision or mission. We're continuing to move forward, but what we're doing is changing our strategy to achieve that mission. And I think that's kind of where we have been looking at that with our work here. So when you think about it, for the contribution of MTSS at the state level, the SEA really plays a critical role in the development and support for local capacity for MTSS to make sure that's implemented with fidelity and it's sustained and scaled across the state. But we also know that the state can help out with refocusing and strengthening that investment in local capacity, so it can address our current unique context that districts and schools are facing. So to kind of give you an idea of the approach that we have been looking across the cascade, as Brandi talked about, from the the state on down to the classroom, we are saying that the closer you are to students at the classroom level, the more you should really focus on specific educational practices that are research informed, that have a high confidence of matching to student need. And the further you're away from the level of the student moving up to the state, the more you should be focusing on supporting structures. So what we mean by that is, what can we do to support educators who support those who support students? So it's much more a focus on the supporting infrastructure at the state level. We also take this idea of alignment across. So we should be aligning our efforts at the student level to really look at the analysis. So that's our unit of analysis, to see if students are getting better. At the school level, we're seeing it as a level of intervention. So school-wide approaches to multi-tiered system support at behavior, at academics. And then at the district level, that's the level of implementation, which provides management resources. And many states invest in regional approaches, regional education agencies, BOSIs in some states, AAs in others. And in our state, it's intermediate school district. So how do we support those regional entities to provide technical assistance to support districts and again to support schools and students. And at the state, it's the coordination of it all. So I want to start out with this level of coordination at the state. Now, Brandi mentioned the guide, and in that guide, it talks about the graphic around leadership and teaming and what are the stakeholders and the visibility and getting down to implementation through training and coaching. And in the guide, there's key considerations for each of these levels. There's what to do prior to the return of school, what to do during the return to school, and then after initial return. So just a couple recommendations to summarize some of this. First, go back to basics. What's the smallest thing we can do to get the impact, and how can we do it well? How do we select a few practices that have high confidence of success based on needs of individuals and the context of the setting and the capacity to implement well? And the third recommendation is reestablish commitment for the work. So here's some examples looking at these recommendations. So for promoting equitable and meaningful outcomes, we're saying basics, we need a comprehensive approach that focuses on these four major themes: effective environments, socio-emotional well-being, high leverage instruction, and family engagement. So with effective environments, how do we provide positive school climate to motivate students and educators to be in school and promote environments that are conducive to learning? The socio-emotional well-being, it helps address personal challenges experienced during education disruptions and return to school. The high leverage practices really help us to focus on learning that's affected by this COVID slide and missed educational opportunities. And then finally, with the family engagement, these partnerships are essential, really important right now because of the hybrid approach and the different remote learning that has been taking place. And certainly we want to use the data to inform our actions for problem solving, continuous improvement, and support the system for fidelity and sustainability. So when we talk about getting back to basics, we're saying what are the main themes that we should be focusing at, and we suggest it's these areas here. Now, what's interesting, we hear a lot about this COVID slide, that our most vulnerable students are especially impacted by disruptions and the stresses that's associated with this normal. But we also can extend this concept to our vulnerable education systems like schools and districts. And our previous investment of MTSS in these systems seem to be really fragile at this time. So it's crucial that we continue our focus on implementing quality PBS to promote these effective environments. Something to consider when you think about going across time. So starting out with your MTSS implementation, we know that the likelihood of creating meaningful outcomes, we start out saying, should we do this? Is MTSS important for us to invest in and implement? And then we work to do it right. We set up the systems, we install the evaluation, we provide training and coaching around these practices to do it correctly. And then we work to do it better. Well, what has happened with this pandemic and the changes in capacity and priority and resources that impacted our implementation, it really lowered everything. In some places, we're starting over again, and we may have to revisit, should we do MTSS, and then work to do it right. Now, earlier in one of the recommendations, I mentioned revisiting commitment. This is where it's important because we're hearing some districts saying we don't have the resources to do it anymore, implement MTSS, or we have changed our staff and now we don't have the people who can do it well. So we need to go back and revisit MTSS and help people understand that we've invested a lot. This is an effective structure framework that can help improve outcomes, and then work to do it right again. We also know that at the state level, we need to support districts well. And as schools face greater challenges and disruptions and diminishing resources and changes in context and structure, at the district level, we really need to provide greater need to provide the structure and support and communication. So kind of an idea for you to consider. When you think about selection of MTSS, you think about fidelity, implementation, about sustainability, about scaling it up. What we're suggesting is schools play a huge role in selection and fidelity and certainly all these things. But as we go across the categories, districts and states play an increasing role, especially now in supporting the schools to implement it well and to sustain that. So for example, selection, most of that could come from the schools in selecting MTSS as an intervention. But certainly there's a role of district and state. But as we come to sustainability and scalability, excuse me, there's much greater role for the district and state to play in moving forward. Second round of recommendations. We've invested in MTSS structures. If you look across surveys across states, many, if not most, are saying they're implementing MTSS, particularly with the Every Student Succeed Act. So we're recommending strengthen what you've built upon with your investments. Prioritize your leadership team so you have structure to do planning, evaluation, and adjusting implementation. And allocate the resources to support this work. And certainly use your data to inform decisions. So one framework that we talk about is we have an implementation and planning team who provides the work of management coordination. At a school district level, this may mean somebody from a cabinet position, assistant director of special education, the assistant superintendent for instruction may be on this team. And then they provide coordination and provide it back to that cabinet level, which would be the executive leadership, the superintendent, assistant superintendents, directors. And then that work from the implementation team not only is a communication going back and forth, but it also provides down to the technical assistants, training and coaching providers who support the schools. So provide this example here because during our time, we want to make sure that implementation planning team is supported well. Especially, this is just breaking down. So we start out with a vision, political support, priority that's given to the planning team. They collect, summarize, evaluate, create a district plan, monitor, and give it back to the cabinet with executive leadership, who again looks at providing availability, allocation, and resources. So when we talk about revisiting your team, investing, make sure that we are strengthening each of these components so that we can keep our investment in MTSS moving forward. The third set of recommendations is matching practices and supports to the current need. We know our world has changed significantly in the last few months, and the needs of our students have increased as well as the needs for staff and families and the whole community. We want to support these practices through effective systems and provide professional learning for staff in different positions. So right now in Michigan, we are seeing that probably a 13% decrease in educators is what's being predicted. We are also seeing a survey through the union, education union, that 8% of educators are planning on retiring during this time. So we know that the people who have been trained in the past are probably going to be in different positions than they will be in the fall. So one way to look at this would say, let's look at the disruptiveness of the context. So do we have a stable context, or is it more elevated disruptiveness? And then in this matrix, we look at the skill set and the systems. So if the skill set and systems are not in place or not emerging, and it's a elevated disruptiveness, we really need high-level intensive supports. If we have a skill set and supportive systems that are established, and it's a stable environment, it takes low level of intensive supports to keep things going. So we just use this as a way to figure out we can't provide everything to everyone. So let's address based on the skill set, the implementation, and the disruptiveness of the context. One other thing we keep talking about as a tiered approach is there's the systems to support it, and then there's the practices to support so that it can help districts, schools, and educators. And we talk about drivers of leadership and management and professional development and effective organizations. And one thing to consider through this is that when districts have supports for leadership and management, it will help the implementing schools to know what to do, why they should do it, and assistance to get it done. For professional development, it will help the educators know how to do it. And for promoting effective environments, when we have good organization systems, it will make it easy to do it right. And all these things in this sequence will help out with fidelity of implementation. Now, in the guide that Brandi was talking of, I mentioned there's the state table, and then there's a district table, which considers district-wide plans, what to do for remote learning, and then what to do for in-person learning. So want to leave you with this idea that certainly the skills and structures that got us to where we're at before this crisis are going to be very different from those needed during and after the pandemic. So hopefully we provided some information to keep moving forward, to keep that investment and support students to be successful. So I'm going to stop sharing. And then I believe it's time for questions and answers.
Yep, thanks so much. And you should be seeing a reflection slide, discussion and reflection. And I think we have one question right now in the chat pod, but I would certainly invite others to submit their questions through chat, or if you prefer to speak, that's fine as well. But first of all, let me ask a question myself to Steve and Brandi. I know, Steve, you mentioned about teacher shortages in Michigan, and I think that's probably going to be something that all of our states will experience with both retirements due to COVID and due to aging staff, but also folks who are a little concerned about teaching remotely versus teaching in person. Can you share some thoughts on MTSS and PBIS as it relates to remote learning and what you might have learned over the past couple of months and how you apply that moving forward?
Brandi, do you want to start? Because you have a number of resources that are available.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the kind of constant questions right now is how do we adjust? And I loved Steve's slide around pivoting. So we continue to think about good instruction, good behavior support, good social, emotional, and behavioral support. Is that kind of regardless of context? So if we think instead of kind of exactly what it looks like during our in-person instruction, and we kind of pull back to the level of critical features, we can be really thoughtful about how to pivot those critical features into a virtual environment. So it's a really simple example. We often in schools, districts implementing PBIS, have them have a matrix that thinks about what the expectations look like across different settings or routines in their schools. And typically we're thinking physical settings, right? We have like gym, or we have hallway. We have the same idea in classrooms around routines. That exact same process can be used whether we're talking in classroom routines or remote environments. So we can think about what does it look like if we're engaging in a class discussion on a remote or virtual platform. So what are the expectations? What does it exactly look like? And then once we've really defined what it is that we're expecting from our students, we can provide really explicit instruction. So give them opportunities to set them up for success, provide prompts and reminders ahead of time, and then take opportunities to catch them when they're doing it well. I'm also a parent of a rising first grader. That would be a big mistake. And a rising fourth grader. And watching my daughter's kindergarten Zooms just helped emphasize for me how important those really small practices are. When her teacher started off with a reminder about how to stay on mute and take turns in a virtual environment, it went pretty well. When that reminder was forgotten, there was some level of controlled chaos going on for the class meeting. So those simple practices, I think we can pivot pretty successfully into a remote environment when we think at the level of critical feature instead of if we think exactly what it looks like in real life. So I kind of think about the function of the practice instead of the form of the practice being how I would structure what to pivot on. And as Steve mentioned, there's a lot of really nice resources that are hyperlinked throughout the guide. So if as someone else answers, I might pull a couple into the chat box. But to me, the critical feature pivot is the most helpful way to think because it generalizes across a lot of different questions. What would you add, Steve?
You say it very well. So.
Great, so let's go to our first question in the chat pod, and this I would assume could be answered by both of you, and it is, any ideas for screening students virtually? Not only social emotional well-being, but for behavior and academics too.
So I can start, Brandi, and if you want to join in. So I think the way we've been approaching this, you know, in our discussion across with different states and centers, is that we have to think creatively around screening. So screening could be more formal, but it also could be informal, like did students actually show up for the online, you know, lesson? Are students, you know, are we hearing from other sources that students may be struggling? So that there's the actual formal that we could do, or more of the informal looking. I also know that there's a number of resources, as Brandi mentioned, and from the National Center for Intensive Intervention that provides a great resource for looking at. And Brandi, I think you just put that in, right? Oh, no, you put in a different resource.
Yeah, I was peeking at the National Center for Intensive Intervention while you were presenting just to see if they had added newer resources. I know that they have done a fantastic job soliciting information from different publishers around progress monitoring tools, and I think we know a little bit less about how screening functions in a remote environment. But as Steve said, if we think about kind of that informal process of gathering information, I think we have a lot of ways we can do that through connecting with families and learning more about students and their needs.
Now, one thing that's been interesting is historically, through a multi-tiered system support, we would certainly screen several times a year, and we would use the previous year. So we do have some information pre-COVID of students who might have been struggling, but now we're in different situations. So I would not be confident in that by itself, right? I would want to look at additional information.
Kathleen, if you're talking, I think you're still on mute.
Thanks. Our next question comes from Megan Whitaker with NCLD, and the question is, how well do you think assessments can capture where students are academically given all that is going on for them right now? And how effective will those assessments and data collection generally be in a virtual setting?
I think we've been talking a lot about that here in Michigan as well. One of the struggles are how well does it really measure where the student's at, or how much does it measure the quality of instruction, and how much does it measure did the student, even though quality instruction was provided, was the student participating and engaged in that? So it's certainly complex. So our approach has been, we would need multiple sources of information. We need input from educators. We need student input, family input, and certainly, performance to see how well students are doing.
Brandi, anything to add?
No, I think that was helpful. Just to echo what Steve said, I think the multiple sources of information become really critical. I think that, we've always known about the importance of engaging families. We've always talked about that, especially for communities of students with disabilities, but really for all students. I think we learned over spring how critical those relationships and that partnership really is. So I think being able to ensure we're pulling in perspectives across those groups of people is really important as we think about screening and setting students up for success.
So what's interesting is we're talking about these questions, they're really down at a student level, right? Educator student level. And then I think our concern is always, what is the state's role to help districts do that, and districts' role to help educators. So I think that's where we talked about alignment before, to make sure states are talking with districts and districts and states. And
I have another question that was sent to me. It's from Laura Chamberlain. Do you have suggestions or examples of implementing academic interventions virtually? Any links or resources that you can share?
There are some really nice examples across several of the centers that participated in this guide. And so when I'm not talking, I'll see if I can pull some of them into chat. But there's, within the guide, I think it's like the first, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 pages in, there's a table that gives really specific hyperlinks to examples of what it looks like to implement, connect, screen, support, teach, monitor, from a social, emotional, and behavioral perspective, but also from an academic perspective. And so in that list of resources are video examples, lesson plan formats, some really concrete guidance, whether you're thinking about supporting families at home with implementation, or you're thinking about being the educator implementing in a virtual or remote platform. So there are, even in spring, there were some really nice resources developed. And I think over summer, like all of us have been doing, we have a little breathing time, and so more resources are becoming available as we ramp up to August and September.
yeah, so as Brandi's looking for examples, a couple of considerations that we have been looking at. One is, our world's changed almost overnight, right? So we're trying to figure out how to do this instruction in a way that we're not used to, especially when you're old like me, trying to figure out a different way of teaching. So part of it is, how do we allow us to know that we did what we could, and how do we get better all the time, and focus on that. So I think there's more information coming out. I think the other thing is, I've seen some real creative ways that our districts have been focusing on providing effective instruction. So in our Upper Peninsula, it's very remote. We have areas that do not have cell service or internet accessibility. So what they have done is, the districts work with the local radio station, and they have a time period where they're helping to talk about lessons for social emotional support. They have a time period that's for elementary students, and then one for high school level, secondary level students. So it's just different ways that people are trying to be creative, given the limitations of the infrastructure as well. But that is just getting at that there's a different context that need to be addressed.
Great, thanks so much. And one final question before we close out is, do you have any suggestions or resources for observing behavior of students virtually?
I think it depends a little bit on the function of that observation. I think there's really simple tools that would work and extend virtually as well, from things like paper pencil tallies. There's apps that you can use to track data that automatically convert it into a graph. There's a newer app that has just been released from the Center on PBIS that's called Be Positive or B Plus. It is free. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because it allows you to set up custom fields where you can track students. But as someone who focuses on teacher implementation, you can also set up prompts, reminders, and track your own implementation of skills as well. So kind of pulling up to the systems level, whether I'm the educator wanting to make sure I'm doing my best in a remote environment to provide opportunities to respond or praise statements, I can collect that information on myself. If I were coaching somebody, I could pop into a virtual lesson and either collect the data or ask them to send me their data. We could then work together to use data to drive decision making, not just data on student behaviors, but also teacher. So I think if it's to enhance or adjust tier 1 practice, looking at student behavior in that really descriptive way and looking at teacher implementation, some of those apps can be really helpful. I think there's, again, I'm not sure the purpose behind the observation. If it was part of a more significant evaluation, it would be a very different response. But thinking in the tier 1 level, I think there's a lot of simple tools that can be effective. And thanks for popping that into chat. And Justin, thank you for finding all the links before I could find them. That was really helpful.
It takes a team, does it not? Steve, anything to add to that last question?
No, sounds good.
Great. Well, this has been such a great session today. Thank you both, Steve and Brandi, for coming to share your expertise with our state members, and really excited to have you again, Steve, next month, and we'll talk about some of our upcoming webisodes. These 2 webisodes have dates, and I'll mention them in a minute, but I did want to share, Brandi had mentioned the companion document that the National Center of Intensive Intervention is working on to the PBIS resource. And we're in conversations with them right now and expect to have a webisode on intensive interventions around some of these same ideas late September. And we'll look forward to that and posting that data as soon as we have that. But the next 2 webisodes coming up, the next one will be August the 12th. And again, this will feature Steve Goodman of the Michigan MTSS Technical Assistance Center, along with a colleague, Hank Bohannon of Loyola University. And they'll talk a little bit about what this MTSS looks like for school reentry. And I know we know lots of folks will be in that process of school reentry about that time. So hopefully you will find that as a really useful presentation and resource. Then September 15th, we'll be featuring our 4 states who are involved with the Advancing Inclusive Principal Leadership Initiative at CCSSO. And we've been working with these 4 states about 2 years. And we are continuing that work with them over the next several years, thanks to our partnerships with CEDAR and the Oak Foundation. And Kaylin, would you like to add anything on the webisode coming up on September 15th?
I'm really looking forward to highlight the work that's happening in states, and thank you all so much for joining today's webisode, and special thanks to Steve and Brandi for sharing their expertise, and look forward to seeing many of you on our upcoming webisodes next month.
Great, thanks, Kaylin. And we do appreciate you joining us today. This, of course, will be archived on our website, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.